fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 10, Enlightening Encounters. Aside from the heavy leather coat he was stuck wearing, complete with fur lining, there was one thing Winter was certain he'd never get used to. Magic. He had seen it during their daring escape from the glowing city when the once king wielded it like a weapon. Here, the castle staff used it to make ease-of-life changes around them, from cleaning their rooms to supplying food and drink. Heck, he'd even traveled with a bear that was really a man. Or, at least, just an incredibly smart bear. He still wasn't sure it wasn't the latter. But as they finished a mile-long trek through a rather claustrophobic tunnel, carved right through the mountain, he got the impression those other things had been nothing more than parlor tricks. Winter's feet came to a stop as the hall opened up before him to reveal an auditorium-sized room, the ceiling having disappeared above his head. Lining the path was no less than 16 giant statues of varying warriors in full armor. Each one wielded a weapon more sinister than the last, and he couldn't shake the feeling that if their party made one wrong move, the statues would spring to life. However, all that paled in comparison to the door. It was wrought of the same onyx-black stone that made up the hall and much of the castle, but it was carved with intricate runes that glittered in gold. Needless to say, he was impressed, and all that before the door even opened. As it slowly swung out of its own accord, glistening just on the other side was a film of shimmering liquid that encased the entryway like a giant soap bubble. Yep. Magic. Now, being the smart Texan he was, Winter was absolutely not going to be the first one through that door. Nope. Not that he was a coward. Far from it, actually. But it's just common sense to wait for someone else to go first in an unfamiliar, potentially skin-melting magic situation. A sentiment apparently shared by the others, as no one else moved toward the door either. "I've never seen this hallway before." Pyra was moving from statue to statue, gazing up at their hauntingly empty faces. She touched the hem of a dryad warrior's cloak and found it dusty. There were spiderwebs dangling haphazardly between bent arms or kneeling postures, and she turned back to the group. "How long has this been here?" Herron was staring up at a statue that resembled his father, and a deep sense of sadness welled up inside him.
"What does it matter? We've already wasted a full day."
Lucian, annoyed at their delay and slightly hungover, tapped his cane against the floor before using it to point at the door.
"This passage was installed a millennium before even my father's father was born. Now, let's not keep the Wild Queen waiting."
He clicked his teeth in anger when no one moved.
"It's perfectly safe, I assure you."
Pyra removed her hand from the statue to move to the door, glancing at each rune carved into the frame. "How can we trust you? As far as I know, you were never invited before now." His relationship with his mother was complicated, to say the least, but Lucian let the jab slide and waved a hand over to the tall man.
"If you're wary of it, send the werewolf in first."
In fact, he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. No outsider had entered in living memory. The blood in Winter's veins froze, and he swallowed, taking a hesitant step back. Actually, I prefer the term lichen." He chuckled somewhat nervously. "And I definitely did not sign up to be a magical guinea pig." Wailing in aggravation, Piper stomped forward and pushed past the group. She stuck out her mechanical hand and reached through the gossamer soap bubble, wiggling her fingers around for several seconds before she pulled away and gazed down at it. Nothing was remotely wrong with it, other than it being a little cooler now. She shrugged, throwing caution to the wind, as her best friend would, and stepped through. A minute ticked by. Then 2. With a frown, Atticus started walking towards the barrier, but Winter pulled him back. "Give her a tick, kiddo." He had just said those words when Piper reappeared, the portal making a wet, squelching noise as she did. The look on her face was grim, though that might just be her new default expression. "So, question." Piper locked eyes with the Lycan. "Is all that stuff about werewolves and full moons real?" "Well, kind of." Winter scratched at the back of his neck. "I just get all twitchy and stuff the fuller it gets. It's like being on the sidelines of a NASCAR rally with a hangover. It's really loud and confusing, but I can handle it." She leveled a finger at him. "You can't come." Lucian growled, stepping closer.
"Mother was quite clear about who was to attend this little journey."
He reached behind him and grabbed a fistful of the wolf's leather coat and yanked him forward.
"We've already lost the bear and the gnome. He will be going."
"No!" Piper placed her hands on her hips, blocking the door. "We absolutely cannot send a werewolf into a world with 3 moons!" Winter swallowed. 3? "That's right, and 2 of which are full right now. So unless you want to risk getting your face bitten off..."
"This isn't up for discussion, girl."
Lucian took a limping step forward to glare down his straight nose at the young woman.
"We were all ordered before the Wild Queen, and we will all be in attendance, so I suggest you proceed without further complaint."
He gestured to the door with his cane. Piper stayed her retort when she felt a hand on her shoulder. "Perhaps if you composed yourself with a bit more compassion, Lucian, we as a group could work together." Piper folded her arms across her chest.
"Just because you are Elias's wench does not mean you can order me around like one of your filthy subjects."
The words that left Lucian's lips slid along the sneer that had curled there.
"You said it yourself. He is gone, along with your power."
"My right to rule?" Pyra straightened her shoulders. She hadn't spent the night crying over her loss, but had instead spent it studying the bylaws of her kingdom. Several hours before dawn, she had discovered a loophole. "According to your decree, in the absence of the king, next of kin will rule in their stead, not the spouse." Lucian's eyes narrowed.
"Exactly."
Pyra nodded. "That was in his absence. He is not away or missing. Elias is dead. The sentiment was still bitter on her tongue, and a twinge of pain twisted her heart. She steadied herself with a deep breath in through her nose and started again. "Rivaria told me he is no more. Normally, the title would go to the eldest son, but you were removed from the line of succession. Next would be Varen, but you chose to have him declared unfit. Such an oversight." She paused to offer the elf a smile. "With no heirs, the queen shall retain the throne until such time that the council may elect a new line. And due to the chaos in Ebonvane, they are too scattered to focus on such a daunting task." She took a step forward. "I did leave instructions with the few that remained that, should something befall me, Varen is to take my place." She pressed a finger against Lucian's chest and pushed him back a step. "So, yes, I can order you around." "Long live the Queen," Piper snickered. As the tension in the narrow hallway grew, Varen moved between his half-brother and Pyra, more for her sake than his. He knew Lucian had a temper, and he could almost feel the rage bubbling to life. He turned his back on his half-brother and signed a suggestion to the Queen. "Perhaps we could bind Winter's arms and send him through last. That way we could be ready. She wasn't sure she was fully done with the once Regent Lord, but at the pleading look in Varen's eyes, Pyra deflated. Very well. She glanced over to the young girl who shared her face. We will send him through last, arms bound. Her gaze flickered toward the lichen. That way, should he lose control, the 6 of us will be able to drive him back across the threshold. Her golden eyes shot back up to Lucian and snarled, Remember yourself in my presence. Varen sensed a flicker of movement behind him, a rippling down his brother's right arm as the cane began to rise off the ground. But he turned and placed a hand on the elf's chest, shaking his head. Slapping the gesture away, Lucian stepped back and adjusted his robes. He waited until the queen, her look-alike, and the young man stepped through, before he turned his glowering gaze on his sibling, who had torn off a length of fabric from his cloak and began binding the annoying wolf.
The enshrined wilds are a dangerous place, little brother. Someone should tell Her Majesty to be careful, lest you become king before your time.
Not bothering to wait for a response, he stepped through the doorway with a swish of his long robes.
I do not like him. Let's not tell him he still has bits of throw-up in his hair.
Still reeling from the veiled threat, a frown deepened on Varen's brow, and he let out a long sigh in agreement. He cinched the bindings tight and gave the lichen a questioning look. Now, being the smart Texan that he was, Winter could tell when a plan was a bad one. And this was a doozy. But he thought of the promise he'd made to Piper the night before and focused his resolve. I can do this. I can do this. He repeated his mantra several times as he huffed and puffed, attempting to fool his brain into thinking he was brave. Varen nodded and guided him towards the shimmering barrier. I can do this! Winter gave one final shout before he threw himself into motion, before his body could get the best of him and he ran the complete opposite way, launching himself through the door with eyes clenched shut. In the moment when Eric thought he could take no more, that his lungs would burst beneath the soul-crushing darkness enveloping him, his feet slammed into something hard and he buckled to the ground. His hands flew out to catch himself, but someone gripped him hard under the arm and hoisted him back onto his unsteady feet. When he opened his eyes, unsure of what to expect, he was surprised by polished tile floors and eggshell-colored walls. He glanced over at the owner of that hand and was struck by the darkness of his skin tone, black as the feathers of a raven. Fittingly, the magpie god wore an oversized black and white sweater that mimicked his bird markings. Rumus? Perhaps the god simply felt it unnecessary, or it was too noisy, but his question remained unanswered as they moved back into the open doorway of a dark room, avoiding the busy hall. Wait, this looks like... Eric stopped, looking around at the room behind them. Though dark, it was one of the few amphitheater rooms used for the advanced math curriculum. If he squinted hard enough, he could make out his seat from where they stood. The hesitant smile crossed his face as he spun around. It is! Above the giant chalkboard was a familiar coat of arms beneath the words Ravenwood University. It's my old school! He barked a laugh and moved back towards the door to watch the throngs of his old classmates move about their busy afternoon. From child prodigy age, Eric had been offered many scholarships, most of them for places much more prestigious than this. But Ravenwood had been where his father attended, and the allure of walking the same halls had won him over. That, and their physics department had a specialized field dedicated to portal function theory, a woefully understudied phenomenon at that time. The grin on his face faded as the people, rushing to their classes, began to thin, and Eric was left more or less alone with the god.
Why are we here?
Rumus folded his arms behind his back and looked around.
I have no idea.
He turned those yellow eyes on the half-elf.
You chose the destination, not me.
I didn't choose anything. Moving over to a display that held several trophies, Rumus nodded as he eyed the shiny metal awards.
Ah, that explains it.
He observed the names on each plaque before meeting the half-elf's gaze in the mirror at the back of the cabinet.
By not choosing, your subconscious selected a strong memory.
A frown crept across his face as he scoured his mind for what the memory might have been. But a familiar voice shouting his name derailed his train of thought entirely.
Eric!
He spun to see his brother rushing toward him, holding a folder in one hand and the other waving him down. But as Eric went rigid, unsure of what to do, Vel walked straight past him without so much as a glint of recognition in those green eyes. He might be older, but he was still the same man, wasn't he? Eric glanced at himself in the mirror behind the trophy case. No, it was clear he wasn't. Of course his brother hadn't recognized him. He didn't recognize himself. His hair was longer, tickling at his shoulders, his features more gaunt, and the scruff on his face had bloomed into a full-blown beard. He looked every bit the disheveled vagrant that had landed on the sidewalk in his first trip to the past. Eric's attention followed his brother in the direction he'd been heading, and, in that moment, the shock and surprise of seeing Vel, healthy and undamaged, dissolved into an embarrassed cringe. Standing on the other end of the hallway, like polar opposites, was his younger self. He'd give anything to go over there and correct the horrors of his youth. That soul patch and the heavy silver earrings, those baggy clothes and sunglasses above his prescription glasses. I told you it's Rick now. Disgust and shame twisted at Eric's features, and he turned away. He had successfully repressed the memory of the time he'd tried changing his name to E. Rick to be cool, but that cringe-worthy and thankfully short-lived period of his life was on full display. Oh, this memory. Rumus turned away from the shining trophies to blink up at his ward. Eric slunk back into the corner of an alcove containing a water fountain and a trash can, keeping just enough of the hallway in sight so he could watch the two. This is the day my brother ruined my life. He shook the weird sensation of hearing himself speak from the other end of the hallway, and, grimacing, he watched in silence. Rick had finally come to a stop and swiveled, putting on an air of disinterest. What are you doing here? I'm here to talk to you, idiot. I've been trying to reach you for a week. Why don't you answer your phone? Vel, agitated and antsy, winced at the words that fell from his mouth. He'd have to watch his tone when speaking to his brother, tiptoeing around every word, or this conversation would be over before it began. Eric shrugged. I'm busy with my coursework. It's college. Seething internally, Vel held up the folder, stuffed with so many papers the entire thing was ready to burst open. I'm sorry. It's important. It's about Mom. It's always about Mom. Eric rolled his eyes and shifted his stance, folding his arms across his chest as he leaned against the wall. If you need money, I can help, but not as... Vel resisted the urge to slug his brother, but settled on cutting him off with a lift of his hand. It's not about the money. He sighed, clenching his fingers tighter around the folder. I have a job. I can make the ends meet. It's about her doctors. They're all worthless. He raised his brows hopefully. But I did some digging, and there's a research program. Here. I was hoping that maybe you could— Nah. A muscle twitched under Vel's left eye. That's it? Just nah? Look, I put off college long enough. You know I could have gone back when I was 12. Eric unfolded his arms, ignoring how his brother rolled his eyes and mouthed, back when I was 12, at the same time. But if I start asking for favors now, they're going to want them in return. 4 departments have already attempted to poach me, and I'm not changing my field just because you spent an hour on the internet. He dropped his hands. Just go talk to the professors yourself. And would you give a high school dropout the time of day? Yeah. He flicked up his wrist, inspecting his watch. It's 2:30 p.m. Need anything else, or can I go now? Vel tossed his hand up. I'm so sorry to cut into your precious time and ask you to help for a change. Eric pulled the sunglasses off his head to run his fingers through his hair. Always the same old guilt trip. Someone had to take care of Mom after you left. I didn't make you drop out. I didn't make you stay. It's not my fault I have a future. Eric slid the shades back over his head. I can't fix every problem for you. Figure it out on your own. He straightened up, clapping his brother on the shoulder. I'm late for study hall. Vel knew losing his temper would get him nowhere. His gaze shot up to the ceiling as he swallowed his pride and reached out, grabbing his brother by the back of his shirt before he could walk away. Hang on. I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to upend your life. I need some help. He looked down at the folder in his other hand. Mom is getting worse. She's what? Something crashed across the hall, and they both spun to see a man sprawled out on the ground next to a pile of garbage. In his desperation to listen in, future Eric had leaned too far out of the alcove, and the trash can he had been leaning on had toppled over, spilling its contents, and him, to the tiled floor. A handful of students moving from one class to the next stared at him as he scrabbled to upright himself and laughed. They pointed and jeered as he picked up the metal container, shoved the garbage back inside, and waved them off. They didn't linger. It wasn't that funny, and his attention flicked back to his younger self. Vel, still holding the files, rounded on his brother. The distraction had derailed the conversation, and now the man showed no signs of accepting either his pleas or the files. She's your mother too, Eric. It's Rick, and I'm late. Vel's shoulders dropped as he watched his brother slink inside the library. As the door closed, every muscle in his body tensed and fingernails dug into his palms. He wanted to scream in rage, but instead hung his head in defeat. The Eric in hiding looked over at Rumus, his brows shooting up in concern. But that's not what happened. The god bent over and plucked up a chip wrapper off the floor, flexing the metallic innards of it in his hands. He watched the light dance off the surface with greed. He glanced up, showing off his pearly whites.
This isn't a memory.
He stepped back, allowing the young Vel to walk by him on his way down the hall.
It is the past.
No! Eric moved around the god, following his brother at a distance. He felt Rumus step in line behind him, and he turned his head over his shoulder. No, I was supposed to take that folder. At the time, I just did it to make him. He thrust his chin towards Vel, happy. But when I looked inside, I knew I could help. I took it to Professor Ortiz, and the two of us co-created a new field of cybernetics. I changed my major from physics to reconstructive biology because we saved my mother. His words faded away as dark thoughts crept into Eric's mind. If he never saw that folder, if he let Vel leave now without stopping him, his younger self would never go down that path. He would never have dragged his brother through that portal. Vel would never have died, and in the process, billions of lives would be saved. All at the cost of one life, his mother. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing.
Hey, you all right?
Eric's eyes shot up at another familiar voice, and he winced with shame. Vel sighed as he slumped against Lucas, burying his face between his neck and shoulder.
No.
His words were muffled against the other man's shirt.
He won't help.
Not even for your mom.
He's a self-centered ass.
Vel pulled away, his shoulders tightening as his temper flared.
But...
He sighed, deflating again.
He's right. It's his life.
Lucas grabbed the other man's hand, intertwining their fingers as they turned towards the exit.
Why don't you just go and talk to the research professor yourself? I'm sure if you explain your situation, he'll listen.
To a 2.0 average student with no GED? Vel barked a laugh. Your faith in me is astounding. I doubt they'd take me seriously. He sighed and pulled to a stop, his gaze moving down to the folder still clutched in one hand. She's too far advanced to volunteer for the project. Maybe if Dad was still around, he could talk to some of the people here, but... His voice turned bitter. The man's never coming home. Eric's attention shot past the building guilt within him to latch onto the mention of his father. If Dad was there, he could talk to Ortiz, and his mother wouldn't have to die, leaving him to pursue his original major. According to Rumis, changing the past became an issue as those changes began to compound. So, if he chose a single moment to change, rather than go back and forth trying to micromanage each detail, it might be enough to protect the integrity of the timeline. A loophole. He would have to change the past once, meaning he would have to play his cards carefully and choose the exact moment in his past where he could prevent his father from leaving at all. If he did that, he and his brother would never have left home to look for him in the first place. Placing a hand on Vel's shoulder, Lucas leaned over to console him.
Listen, it'll be okay. We can go talk to my dad. You know he used to teach uni back home. Botany, yeah, but I'm sure he can make some calls for you.
Eric scratched at the back of his head as his mind buzzed with ideas and possibilities. First, he had to set this moment right. It was now or never. He looked around to see a pile of backpacks and abandoned ball caps left behind by a rowdy group of hacky-sack players in the room to his left. He snatched up a hat, tucking in the shock of white in his hair, and threw on a pair of pilfered sunglasses. Hoping his disguise would be enough, Eric approached the two and, using his best fake deep voice, he reached out a hand.
Hey, your brother sent me to get that file from you. He said he changed his mind.
Act casual, he thought with a nod to himself. You got this.
Or something.
What? Vel looked from the open hand to the face of the stranger standing before him. Really? When the other man nodded, a shaky smile overtook his concern, and he offered up the folder. Please, if he can do anything, Overjoyed, he let out a chuckle. Just tell him I said thank you. Eric took the folder from his brother, but didn't turn away just yet. He had almost forgotten what Vel looked like without the mismatched eyes or plates of metal on his face. He wanted to remember him like this. Happy. He felt the tension shift into unease and took a step back, nodding at Lucas. As he turned away, he heard, "See, I told you your brother was a good man." Eric's heart sank as he kept his back to them, walking down along the empty corridor to where he knew his past self would be. Rumus followed along silently, pointedly not saying a word.
"I can hear you smiling from here,"
Eric mumbled, not having to turn around to see the impressed look on the god's features.
"I said nothing?"
Rumus put his hands in the air, but didn't wipe away his pleased expression. Eric opened the door to the library and stepped inside. He took a moment, letting the smell of the books and the sound of the copy machine fill him with a pang of nostalgia. He moved through the stacks like he was once again in his 20s, navigating the maze of tables and students to find his younger self with all his old friends. What a bunch of nerds, he laughed to himself. Hopefully he would get to see them all again if his plan worked. He approached his younger self and leaned over the table, sliding the folder in the man's direction. Eric tapped it with a rigid finger.
"You need to read this."
His younger self looked down at the files and then back up, his brows lifting in confusion as he pushed the folder away. "And who the hell are you?"
"It doesn't matter."
Eric shook his head as he shoved the file right back toward his stubborn younger self.
"This,"
he narrowed his gaze,
"is important."
He straightened up, avoiding the awkward stares from the people he once knew, and turned his back on the group. Sure, it may have been a bit cryptic, a random stranger handing out folders with ominous warnings, but he knew himself. He wouldn't be able to resist taking a peek inside now. He reached for the door and flung it open, stepping away from his past and into the hallway. Except it wasn't the corridor of the college. He had re-entered the chapel, Wirt standing in the middle, his hand hanging in midair. A gentle curl of smoke in the shape of a bird wafted in over his shoulder and rustled a few of the crystal baubles of the room before sinking down into the elder rat. Eric's memories began to shift, like an eerie sort of pressure worming through his mind. He still remembered the moment like it was supposed to happen, accepting the folder of his free will, but he also remembered the weird man in the sunglasses.
"You have my vote, kid."
The shaman, speaking with Rumus's voice, dropped his hand and moved toward the half-elf.
"You had the chance to alter your past, to change your future, but you didn't."
Artemis's eyebrow rose sharply. "Oh, I cannot wait to hear this story." His attention split between Rumus's jovial tone and the necromancer's hungry expression for knowledge. Eric did the only thing he could think to do. Scratch at that spot behind his ear.
Yeah. Can't say I wasn't tempted."
They didn't need to know he was already pinpointing a memory he'd need to prevent his father from leaving. Wirt tucked his hands behind his back, staring up at the shining baubles that hung from the ceiling. He lost himself in the way it caught the light and sent a rainbow of color across the room.
"That is simply the allure of the past."
He shifted his gaze to the elf.
"If I may, what stopped you?"
"My brother."
The lie fell so easily from Eric's lips, he almost believed it himself.
I hadn't seen him that desperate before.
Another lie.
I just didn't want to hurt him.
Anymore. That, at least, was the truth, and maybe the entire thing had a shade of honesty to it. He didn't want his brother to hurt anymore, and if he could go back, find the right moment, he'd never have to hurt.
Family.
Wirt turned away, reaching through a pile of forgotten shinies and gifts to pluck out a small leather satchel. He filled it with a few baubles and knickknacks before sealing it shut.
"Speaking of, you still have 4 more of my siblings to meet."
He straightened out and spun, holding out the bag.
"Ykrip will return your possessions and see you back to the shore in the outskirts of Levermorn."
Eric took the satchel, his hand dropping a little at the weight, and he nervously licked his lips as he voiced the most gnawing of his concerns, something his entire plan hinged on.
What if I had changed the past?
The shaman cackled, tossing his hands in the air and knocking several of the crystal orbs around, sending light and rainbows flying across the room as they warbled back and forth.
I would have righted the path, and you would be one more step towards death.
His words faded to a chuckle as he smiled beneath his hood.
Enjoy your stay in Dappelmere.
Eyes clenched shut in fear, Winter stumbled out onto solid ground, waiting for the moment where his wolf would spring out and his friends would be nothing more than a red smear. Thankfully, after several tense moments, the only thing that happened was his ears popped with the apparent pressure change. Sure, his skin was a bit itchier now, like it was covered in ants, but that could very well have been from the leather coat rather than the wolf. And yeah, the sound of his own breathing was grating on his nerves, but that could just be stress. He was fine. Yep, totally fine. He peeked open an eye to see his 5 companions staring at him with baffled amusement. Winter lifted his hands, still bound together, and offered them all a cheeky thumbs up. "Everything's okay." Pyra rolled her eyes, but there was a smirk playing around her lips. She had to admit, when the man introduced himself, his name and what he was, she was a little more than hesitant to allow such a creature inside her castle. But as he stood before her with a goofy grin and an attempt at a heroic stance, she could firmly say this dog was all bark and no bite. The prince stepped forward to untie him, but Winter shook his head. Let's leave these on for a bit longer, yeah? Give me a moment to acclimate." With a nod, Herron moved back and cast his attention elsewhere, to the land he had only read stories about. They had exited the odd doorway out onto a massive stone bridge that had been carved into existence from the eastern side of the mountains. The door stood as impressive on this end as it had been on the other, framed by a waterfall that broke to either side of it, fine mist sparkling in the golden sunlight. Arches and curling flourishes of the bridge depicted heroic stories of maidens and forbidden love. They glittered in the afternoon sun, which was odd because it had been just after dawn when they embarked on this journey. On the far end of the bridge was a thick forest that stretched endlessly on, painted in oranges and vibrant reds, a sea of autumn leaves. The low sun washed everything aglow with warmth, and gentle birdsong drifted in with the crisp breeze that smelled of fall. Flickering yellow points of light danced above the canopies and along the ivory structures that pierced up into the sky like the remnants of a long-dead creature. He saw that beyond the forest, barely visible with the distance, was the largest tree he had ever seen in his life. His heart beat faster. It was a Rinian. He had read a tale or two of the mother tree, but the books could not capture the way the boughs and leaves were hidden between the clouds, offering only glimpses of their autumn shades when the wind whistled through them. As his eyes traveled along the massive tree, Herron caught sight of what Piper had been afraid of. 2 full moons hung in the sky, and a third rested near the horizon. One was gold, reflecting the sun, and the other's silver. In a breathtaking display of finery, he realized the Enshrined Wilds wasn't just part of the continent, but a completely different world. But something was wrong with the sky. It looked shattered, as if a massive hammer had been cracked against a dome, causing fissures of blue to spread across it in every direction. It wasn't until he saw one break free and shoot to the ground in a flash that he knew what it was. The fissures were moving, just imperceptibly slow. No, it was lightning.
"Ah, the Folkgrave party. You have arrived at last."
Pyra turned to see a pair of tall, pale, elven guards were standing at the other end of the bridge. Each wore glimmering gold armor embellished with stylized falling leaves and curled trees. One held a long spear and a shield, while the other had their hand firmly attached to the grip of their sword.
"If you please, Her Majesty the Wild Queen is eager to get these proceedings underway."
Lucian cast a glance at Pyra.
"I told you Mother would not appreciate our delay. We are here to escort you to Amber Hollow."
They pointed at a line of jagged crystals that lined the dirt trail leading into the forest.
"And do your best to stay within the protection of the path. Everything beyond these stones is home to the untethered Fae. Even the Wild Queen does not command them. And should you meander, rescue would be slow."
But Pyra could hardly hear a word their guides had said. Her attention was focused on the fractured sky and the occasional bolt that descended off in the distance. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she glanced at the two armored men.
"The sky, is that normal?"
The one who had addressed them prior shook his head.
"It is one of the reasons you have been summoned, and the reason you were requested yesterday. Your world is bleeding into ours, and the time barrier can only hold it back so long."
Time barrier? Another bolt broke free and descended almost sluggishly to strike one of the many giant trees, leaving only a blue afterimage in its wake.
"Oh, that looks like the lightning that hit our airship."
Atticus, holding his loaned library book over his head, peeked out from beneath the spine.
"Huh, the stabilization routine must not have gotten this far yet."
Piper grabbed her brother by his shirt, hauling him across the bridge to solid ground. She had seen what that lightning was capable of, and the last thing she wanted was to be on a bridge over a chasm with a raging river at its base. In the process of helping Winter cross the wet flagstones, Varen failed to notice the rush of the others to evacuate the bridge, but a tingling on the back of his neck caused him to look up. Zigzagging across the sky, a lazy bolt of blue lightning was rocketing towards his friends.
"Oh, not good."
He wanted to scream, to warn Pyra, but instead the power surged through Varen's body and launched him from the spot, the little shadow bug pouring itself into his limbs. He felt his palm connect with the Queen's shoulder as the electric beam hit the ground, tearing up earth and stone in its path. With all his might, Varen shoved Pyra out of the way and knocked the two guards back several steps. But he couldn't stop, his momentum too great. A hand grabbed him by his arm to wrench him out of the way, but it failed to slow him down, and, looking over his shoulder, both he and Lucian continued forward. The roar of thunder and exploding earth deafened them all, and, as the intense glow faded, Pyra hauled herself to her hands and knees. She ignored the pain from her scraped palms and the mud on her skirts to thank the prince, but there was nothing before her save for an empty path marred with a jagged trench, the same spot she had been moments before. Her heart jumped into her throat as she spun around, scanning those beside her.
"Varen!"
Panic overtook her senses as Pyra stepped toward the edge of the chasm, but the prince was gone, as was Lucian. She grabbed one of the guards, hauling him to his feet.
"Take us to the Wild Queen, now!" "I don't understand. What's she supposed to do?"
Piper, still holding her brother protectively, glanced around as her own heart pounded against her chest. This wasn't her first encounter with that blue lightning. Pyra knew Varen wasn't dead, but displaced.
"We need a rescue party."
The guard nodded quickly and helped his comrade to his feet.
"Of course."
Piper stepped in line, the Queen already rushing down the path, when she noticed they were another member short.
"Where'd Winter go?"
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
You're not taking into account what Richard Feynman said about...
Feynman? Seriously, we're talking about string theory. Feynman didn't even believe in that.
No.
Hey, party people.
Hey, there
man.
he is.
Ensign Rick beaming aboard. I heard something about physics.
That can wait. Bruce, show him what you got.
B-Dog got something, huh?
Well, I know a guy who knows a guy who hooked me up with the first images from NASA's Mars mission.
What? Those aren't even published yet. How's the resolution?
We were waiting for you, bro.
Dude, let's do it.
Hold up, I'll stream the theme song to 2001 Space Odyssey.
We are so cool.